Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us here for this annual event. I see many of you who have been to all of our events, and you'll recognize some events make me nervous. The Eisendrath Symposium is such a relaxing event for me because it's about Charles, and when I think about Charles, I feel very calm.
Julia never says that.
I feel calm about you because I know Julie is there to pull you back from the brink all the time. So, and it's, we've been doing the Eisendrath Symposium. This is our 7th annual Eisendrath Symposium, and we did it for 2 years remotely and had wonderful events during the pandemic, but it's very nice to be back together again, and especially with the guest I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event. The Knight Foundation made this event possible. If you were at Charles's retirement party in 2015, you may remember we announced the creation of this event with support from the Knight Foundation and the International Institute and DPTV, who has become a wonderful partner helping us to share our events to a broader community. Even though we are back in person, we know that many people are not yet back in person, and we have people who started following us during the pandemic who still like to consume our events and have come to expect us to stream. And so we're very happy to have DPTV as a partner in that effort. So to the man of the hour, I'm going to ask Charles Eisendrath to come up. We do this event, you can come up while I'm talking. We do this event in honor of Charles, not just purely for honorific sake, but we are in the fall, I hope many of you know, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Knight Wallace Fellowships Program, which started as the Michigan Journalism Fellowships Program. And as Charles built the program over his 30 years as director, one of the most amazing things he did was to really build international journalism into the core DNA of the program. When I applied to the fellowship in 2008, to come to the fellowship in 2009, I applied because of that reputation that this fellowship had, that it was very interested in international news. By the time I applied, the program was doing international trips, and Charles had built that reputation that made it different from some other programs. And so for me, coming in as director, it was important to signal that even though the director was changing, this core value of the program was unchanged, and that we valued what Charles built and that we would continue to grow it. And so with that, I will introduce you to my dear Charles, who will talk to you a little bit about himself, maybe about syrup, and a little bit about Fred.
Thanks very, very much. Fred de Sam Lazaro is I don't want to say just a remarkable human being. In the small entity of our programs here, he is a serial first. He's the first person to be honored by the program for 2 things, spanning 2 directorships. He gave the Graham Hovey Lecture one year. That's a lecture honoring my predecessor. It consists of bringing back to campus a fellow who goes back to journalism after a fellowship here and does remarkable things, and with and for journalism. Fred won it for that. I have to say that I believe he came during a time when, I believe he came in 9/11 or 9/13. 89. No, this is when he gave the university closed down after a little event in New York, which has become known as 9/11. The university closed down, but Wallace House did not close down. And we decided that we would go ahead with the Graham Hovey Lecture. I think it was the only public event that week at the University of Michigan. Fred scrambled, came, got himself here, and gave the talk. It was just a great thing. It was a great thing for Graham Hovey and the lectureship. Now he has been selected by Lynette and her committee to deliver the Eisendrath Symposium talk. I want to tell you, each and every one of you, how thrilled I am that this event exists and you've carried it forward. International news and international travel was central to my career, central to my thinking, central to my vision for the fellowships, and I tried over 30 years to make sure that we got the travel and the people that best represented it. It's a big event for me and a big event, I think, for the program. So Fred got an early version. He came in 88 and 89. I had begun running the program only in 1986. And my mantra was, we live in a period in which the industry of journalism is crumbling. It's falling apart. Jobs are dropping by the way, so I don't have to tell you that. We got more and more people applying as freelancers because the organizations were gone. What else can they do? So Fred got an early version of do-it-yourself. There is room, increasing room now, to go build your own news organization. And I tried to help the people who wanted to do that as much as I could during their fellowship by hooking them up with mentors from the business school and other places, but also hooking them up with funders, and mostly supplying a carrot and a stick, meaning a kick in the rear end to go try it. And Fred is one of the ones who he took it seriously, and he took it to the highest degree of any of them thus far. Undertold Stories is a miracle. It specifically concentrates on stories that are, as the name implies, undertold. When I first went on his board, he asked me what I thought, and I said, first thing, that's the worst title for a program I've ever heard in my life. Who the hell has ever heard of that for Undertold Stories? But I was wrong. It turns out to be a great title, and it describes exactly what he does. You will see it on PBS News. He's commissioned to do 12 of these programs a year. He does 24. That means 12 out of his own pocket. Another thing that he does, besides generosity of spirit, is that last fall in New York, he put together the first ever program of its kind and from his institution, which is located in St. Paul, Minnesota, in New York City, on remembering the Holocaust and remembering the coverage of the Holocaust. It was at Fordham University. It was standing room only, and it was a huge, and very emotional event. So Fred is going to be here talking about international news, and I hope I don't know if he's going to show the piece that started the Fordham program, which was about the English Schindler. There was an English version of Schindler who rescued lots of Jewish kids during the war, and unlike that Schindler, went home to England and disappeared. He never said anything until Fred found him and did a PBS News show on him, which got a lot of attention. So with that, I give you my friend for a very long time, Mr. Fred de Sam Lazaro.
And I just want to go over some logistics. We do have people following us by live stream, and we've got one of our fellows, Meg Martin, who's following social media and will be taking questions that are coming in from people watching the stream. When we're done with the talk, we have Melissa and Alexis, part of our Wallace House team, who have microphones, and they'll bring the microphones around so we can have a robust discussion. And Charles talked a lot about Fred. The one thing I will add, if you saw something that I posted today, I believe, and this may be a challenge to our current fellows, that Fred has the best traveled Knight Wallace hat in all of journalism. And so I don't know if some of you remember this PBS cartoon called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? I sort of watch PBS NewsHour like that. So I'm watching to see where Fred is and if I'm going to be able to spot the hat. He's reported since 1985 from more than 70 countries, many of them with many return trips, deep coverage in places that are often left out of network news and cable news in the United States. And I'm sure we'll get into this in the conversation. One of the things that I respect so much about Fred's reporting, and I look for in the stories after I look for the hat, is the fact that in a time in journalism, and this is mainly for our fellows in the room, where we're talking a lot about positionality and who is reflected, whose values are reflected in the stories, the majority of Fred's reporting for PBS NewsHour has been from the Global South, built around people who are from those places with their lives, not necessarily centering an American, not necessarily centering the point of view of someone who's American or European in the lives of those people. He reports about people from within their space and allows them to have dignity in the stories that he tells. And I think that the work he does is the kind of work we should be studying and lifting up through our program. And so I will invite Fred to come up.
Thank you, Lynette, and thank you, Charles. And I want to issue a clarification to begin with. The story about Nicholas Winton, the British Schindler, was by no means one that I discovered. It was Winton's wife who discovered his papers 50 years after he stopped worrying about it, went to the BBC in 1988, which revealed it. 60 Minutes did it. I did a story about a children's book about Sir Nicholas Winton by Peter Cease, which is sort of what we do, and it's the reason we're the undertold story, not the untold story. These stories had been told earlier.
And that's it. I need editing.
Well, there you have it. And thank you, Lynette. That was very, very generous. I want to begin on this hat issue. There are dozens of very eminent and accomplished Knight Wallace alums, but I have to assert that I have the farthest traveled KWF hat. Most recently in South Sudan and in Pakistan, coincidentally, in both countries in IDP camps, or internally displaced persons camps, where people fled from conflict or climate, or both. But even here, Lynette, there's a sense of decorum. This is the community elder who came out to greet us, and he decided that my headgear was just not right, and instead placed on my hat a Sindhi topi, a forehead scorcher, and you can see that my Knight Wallace hat had to go under my shoulder. This is the picture of the fellows class of 88-89, aside from the class of 22-23, clearly, as you can see, the best looking group of Knight Wallace fellows. Mr. Eisendrath is off at the extreme right, looking just as he did a minute ago at this podium, as you can see here. It is a real honor to speak at the Eisendrath Symposium. I need to add my voice to the chorus of fellows to say thank you, Charles. Charles Eisendrath, from our first encounter, impressed me as a swift and clear thinker, honest, sometimes brusque communicator, elegant in prose and comportment, self-confident with a high tolerance threshold for risk. Charles, I've delivered eulogies that were far less gushing than that. Now you live to 120. Thank you. Your example has been really aspirational to a lot of careers, and I'm really grateful for your help on the Undertold Stories project. And now the fellowship. For a brown immigrant with no credentials or pedigree from any J school of note, based in flyover country, I could never have dreamed of a career as an international correspondent for one of America's most prestigious and respected broadcast news organizations. But it was the fellowship that allowed me to dream to travel to India for the first time as a journalist and full-grown adult. And I've been back virtually every year since, sometimes more than once. With classes at the School of Public Health from eminent people like Jill Joseph, I learned about the HIV epidemic, just as infection rates were beginning to soar in sub-Saharan Africa. And the fellowship gave me the cred to pitch stories on that topic from the region, and I've not stopped. I got to know giants in the field of public health. Francis Collins, long before he went on to head the Human Genome Project and the NIH. And Larry Brilliant, true to his name, soon and long after his notoriety on the front lines of the smallpox campaign, the only disease so far in history to have been eradicated from the face of the earth. And I continue to have a close friendship with him. And I think the fellowship experience certainly helps me think entrepreneurially in ways that have enabled me to do fulfilling work and put protein in my children's diet, frankly, amid all the upheaval that Charles and Lynette have mentioned that we've seen in this business, including at the NewsHour. So for the next hour or so, I'll try and explain how I've tried to wrap this thing called the Untold Stories Project around basically a shoe leather journalism operation, trying to create a niche that's informed by personal experience, background, understanding the limits of what we could and could not do, and including understanding organizational politics and optimizing our work for impact. It's an aspiration. It's always frustrating. It's frustrating a lot of the time, but in the end we continue to produce stories that are well received and that amplify many unheard voices and perspectives. I would never subject you to nearly an hour of listening to me, so I'm going to punctuate my talk with some of those voices, excerpts, and reports from our archive. That archive dates back to the early days of to my early days at the then McNeil-era NewsHour, when we bandied a slogan, a motto that would distinguish us from the commercial networks. This was serious news. And as Robin McNeil used to joke, we dare to be boring. That's a daring motto in this business. And as I look at some of my work from those early days, I wonder if I took that motto a little too seriously. I think journalists, all of us, have a compulsive disorder where we're always trying to edit something that's gone out. It could always have been better had we had a chance to tweak it for clarity. But I don't think people who've watched the NewsHour then, or especially now, would describe it as boring. Some might. There may be some topic areas of less interest than others, but overall serious need not be boring at all. And the PBS NewsHour, until recently, with Judy Woodruff as executive editor, has long been one of the most respected broadcast news organizations and trusted by opinion leaders. This is a poll from 2019, and there are more recent ones that corroborate this. Lynette gave me wide leeway with the title of my talk, Keeping International Stories in the News. I should add that our stories evolved quickly from being largely international to truly global after May 25th, 2020. And as some of you know, that was the day when George Floyd was murdered just a few miles from my front door in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was murdered in Minneapolis, of course. Speaking of mottos, this is one that I've used for the Untold Stories Project, even if it feels a little bit cliched by now, making the foreign less foreign. It's sort of personal for me in a weird metaphorical way from my own career, which began in Duluth, Minnesota, in radio. And even in public radio, your accent could not sound too foreign in those days. If you were on the radio, you had to sound like the voice of God, strong, deep baritone ideally. And God knows, like you were from Middle America, like Tom Brokaw. I like to say that my first boss there methodically scraped Bangalore off my tongue. Say vote, not wote. Say third, not turd. What we're trying to do at the Untold Stories Project is journalism that earns a viewer's attention and perhaps empathy because it feels relevant and in the end is not so foreign even if it's coming from a distant place. The challenge, of course, is there's very little appetite for chronic poverty and human suffering, especially in places where it seems endemic. There are places, by the way, that are not foreign to me, having grown up in India. And then again, we're in the news business. How do you pitch stories when, sadly, there's nothing new about, say, malnutrition in India or pick your country in Africa? And the only way we really have been able to do this successfully, to draw eyeballs, is with strong, character-driven, solutions-oriented reporting. We've tried to find people like these, social innovators, social entrepreneurs. I'm beginning to get tired of those terms. But they're people who've tested ideas and had some success at some scale in addressing an aspect or consequence of poverty. A show of hands, how many people can recognize or identify 4 of those faces on the screen? 3, 2. There's one Nobel laureate in the mixed, whom we profiled the year before he won, and I take full credit for his having won it. Upper right-hand corner is the Indian anti-trafficking activist Kailash Satyarthi, for example. But this is the benefit of having the Untold Stories Project. These are people who don't want necessarily the notoriety, but they've had an enormous impact. They're very charismatic people, and they're able to provide, to drive the stories for us. And wherever possible, or in many cases, they've helped us go beyond stereotypes. We're always looking for the undertold story in a large story, and I hope to show you some examples of that. I'm going to begin with the example of Ashesi, which is a university in Ghana that was started just under 2 decades ago. Okay, we need some audio. Say again? I'm not getting it right now, sorry. How might we? Oh, you know what? Plug and play. Sorry about that.
It looks like a pretty typical college campus, with students working in computer labs, studying at the library, or hanging out with friends. But Ashesi University in the West African nation of Ghana has embarked on an experiment which its founder hopes will help start to fundamentally change the entire continent.
In the next 3 decades or so, the population of Africa is going to double. And something like 40% of working age people are going to be Africans in the world. A lot of jobs need to be created. And so we need to be educating the next bench in a way that they're going to go create those jobs and create those opportunities for people.
Patrick Awa was born and raised in Ghana, but came to the United States on scholarship to get an undergraduate degree in engineering from Swarthmore and an MBA from the University of California, Berkeley. He went on to become a program manager at Microsoft.
Conferences, yeah.
When he decided to return to his homeland, he assumed he'd start a software company, but quickly realized the system of higher education was so poor there wasn't a competent workforce to hire.
Experts say the problem with education in Africa is not so much that there aren't enough institutions, but rather it's in what students are taught and how they're taught it, with emphasis much more on rote learning and memorization, much less on critical thinking, on thinking for oneself.
Under colonial rule, and the educational system was really designed for that, to educate people to follow instructions and to do things in a very consistent way.
So Awad decided he had to start his own university. With money from American friends, colleagues, and foundations, he raised $2.5 million to open a school with an initial class of 30 freshmen in 2002. Ashesi has now grown to a campus of nearly 800 students. The guiding principle throughout has been a laser-like focus on 3 principles: ethical leadership, innovation, and entrepreneurship.
We need a lot of innovation. We need people who are trained to drive that. And we need people who are going to be working on the government side, who are going to create an enabling environment for that.
Those are the kind of voices you rarely hear coming out of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's one of scores of people we've been able to identify, and it doesn't take a Herculean effort to do that. You learn, if you watch the entire piece, that this is a continent that that suffers a steady brain drain, whose best graduates are lured by employers in rich countries. More than 90% of Ashesi's graduates have found careers that have kept them in Africa. What Patrick Awa is trying to do is create a class of entrepreneurial leaders who are committed to nation building, make decent livings, and of course the hope is that this will ripple into the political sphere, where leadership invariably has its roots in the military. It really is a revolutionary idea. I want to go to Calcutta, India, a city that was made famous by a diminutive Catholic nun that some of you might remember, and made infamous for its poverty, for the poverty that she highlighted. I found another nun, an undertold nun, not as famous, but in many minds just as worthy, and reported on her twice, beginning in 1998, looking for the undertold story right in the aftermath of Mother Teresa's passing. And then I looked her up again about 10 years later.
For Sister Cyril Mooney, attacking the root cause of poverty is just as important. She has been a fixture on Calcutta streets for 4 decades. Like Mother Teresa, she came to be a teacher in schools run by the Loreto Order. Unlike Mother Teresa, who founded her own mission, Sister Cyril stayed with education.
Mother Teresa, her work is never finished, because you give a handout to someone, people will come back for another handout. So, as I say, her work is necessary in the case of starving, destitute people. Our approach is to educate the child, put the child standing on their feet, give them a good job, and then they're settled for life.
Jarna Naskar is one of 7,000 barefoot teachers trained by Sister Cyril, achievement that has not gone unnoticed.
Sister M. Cyril Mooney.
In 2007, India's government recognized her with one of the country's highest civilian honors, rarely bestowed on foreigners.
I ask myself, what are you here for? Are you here to produce agents of human change among your children? Are you here to change the mental set of people? So even if you do it with a small number, it spreads. After all, Mahatma Gandhi was only one man. He managed to get the might of the British Empire out of India, which is something quite fantastic. I mean, we can do it if all of us will work together.
She's won all kinds of awards in the years since then, and is revered for transforming education, improving the lives of perhaps millions of children across the province of West Bengal and elsewhere in India. But was forced into retirement a few years ago, and that's fodder for an upcoming follow-up story that might well morph into a book someday. examining the widespread ricochets of the Irish church abuse scandal and nun politics. But I digress. I want to go next to Pakistan, which, as you might remember, endured epic floods late last year, inundating an area equal to the landmass of Great Britain, displaced 35 million people. Pakistan is one of the most climate change vulnerable countries in the world. There were floods 2 years ago, 2 years before that, and an epic event in 2011. Again, the more chronic the condition becomes, the tougher it is to sustain public interest and reflecting that editorial interest. What are the news stories? And that's why we look for stories like a profile we did about Yasmin Lari that aired recently.
The village of Pano and 12 others are the brainchild of globally acclaimed architect Yasmin Lari, the first female to qualify as an architect in Pakistan.
Unless we find solutions.
82-year-old Lari has won several awards in a career that focused at first on designing modern buildings, like the Finance and Trade Center in Pakistan's commercial capital, Karachi.
You must know about architects that, we're all trained to control everything. Nothing should be different from what we have decided, what we design. And here was a different way of working altogether. You have to lose your ego.
In retirement, she found her calling at the intersection of architecture and social justice, she says, beginning with the devastating 2005 earthquake in Kashmir, where she'd planned to spend 3 months doing relief work.
Well, it didn't quite work out that way, but I found there was plenty to do there.
Her focus shifted with the urgent need for structures that can be built quickly and sustainably in a country slammed in recent years by extreme climate events, moving away from concrete and steel and using more local, low-carbon and low-cost materials.
When I was a practicing architect, I built some huge monster buildings with using a lot of concrete and steel. And I found that 40% of carbon emissions are because of the conventional construction.
Among her signature projects is this pedestrian-only street in the heart of Karachi, emphasizing green space and terracotta tile, which drain rainwater much faster than the usual concrete.
Concrete is the worst thing, because everything becomes totally impervious.
For mass shelter projects, she found a game-changing substitute in lime, an abundant mineral that, mixed with traditional mud, becomes stable and water-resistant, she says.
I found it was an absolutely miracle material because it stabilized the earth completely and could last out for years if you submerged it in water, and we've tested that.
Lari's structures incorporate climate-smart design and materials with traditional ones. The key is to build on higher ground, add a short platform for additional protection from floodwaters, and use a sloped thatched roof.
It's made out of 8 prefab panels, and then it has a structure, a roof which is like an umbrella. So there's a huge amount of air movement. So it's very comfortable inside. My own dream is really that if I could just save people from displacement, if there could be just these structures which will make sure that people can stay in them.
About 5 million Pakistanis remain without permanent shelter. And the goal here is to not just build homes for people, but to train local residents to do it themselves. The hope is that this know-how can then be transferred village to village, creating not just sustainable homes, but also jobs.
And Lari says she's tried to make sure residents can make something to sell, which has allowed many to emerge from extreme poverty. The reason she credits for this success?
So I managed to get women mobilized to do things. And I found that I could get the results very quickly.
Much of that entrepreneurship is around cleaner cook stoves. Champa Kanji learned to build these stoves, or chulas, several years ago. Now she earns a living building them and training others in neighboring villages.
My husband joined me, and we'd go around to villages, and we'd make between 8 and 10 chulas in a day. We were earning a good wage. Now I hope that it will spread more widely.
The stoves range from the simple to very customized, like this demonstrator model in Pano village. For women like Dani, who uses one name, it's made preparing the family meal far less burdensome.
The new stoves are very nice. There's less smoke in your face, and it's much safer for the children.
Suddenly, women's postures changed. Because earlier they were crouching on the floor, on the ground, and suddenly every woman's back was erect. Suddenly she was proud, as if she was sitting on a throne. And women are in the lead in everything that I'm doing. But once they are strong and confident, I think they will they bring about a change. And we've got to bring about a change. We can't go on like this.
This is, of course, Women's History Month. And while the NewsHour does do commemorative pieces, notably for Black History Month, we don't wait for these. The Yasmin Lari piece could have been held until March, but it went on in January because at their very core, these are just simply good stories that happen to concern women or are about them, or African Americans. Things, events, people we've just not heard from historically. And when it comes to women's issues, the toughest ones to discuss by policymakers, by journalists alike, are those that concern the space between the navel and the knee, as an economist in Thailand, Michai Vaidya, puts it. One point of pride for me is that we have done this for a program that, by the way, airs during the dinner hour. I understand the aesthetic concerns, but consider the numbers affected by some of these issues, and there's just no question that they are worthy and deserve our attention. Female genital cutting. It's a practice that 200 million women have endured across 3 continents. This picture is from our report in Senegal, where we profiled one group that successfully helped thousands of communities abandon the practice. And the key word here is abandon. The communities themselves deciding that they would abandon this practice in consultation with other communities. It wasn't eradicated, which is something that's been tried top-down for centuries by missionaries, by governments, with very little success. Labor trafficking, which is a curse that's endured inordinately by women. This was from a story we did in Kuwait, in Cameroon. Kuwait is just one of the Gulf countries where thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, of African and Asian women are trafficked and trapped into slave-like servitude. Sex trafficking gets attention, and it deserves it. We've done some of those from India and the Philippines, but there are about 4 times as many people trafficked into slave labor than into the sex trade. It's the underreported side of trafficking. Water and sanitation. 1 in 3 people lack safe water. 3.5 billion lack what the CDC calls safely managed sanitation in their homes. Menstrual hygiene. Menstrual hygiene. Let's watch this.
But first, an unlikely innovation from an unusual innovator. Special correspondent Fred DeSam Lazaro has the story of one man who has made it his mission to bring affordable hygiene products to women in India. It's part of our series, Agents for Change.
Arunachalam Muruganantham says he was a born tinkerer, obsessed with figuring out how things worked, from toys to bicycles. He grew up in poverty after his father died young, dropped out of school, and became a welder, a lower middle-class occupation in India.
To support my mother, I stopped my schooling.
But his natural curiosity apparently knew no bounds. Years later, it took him into a strictly taboo area in India's tradition-bound society, menstrual hygiene.
We are able to break the taboo and using it.
He's become known as India's pad man.
Your goal is to have every woman in this country use sanitary pads if they need it.
Yeah, it's a movement.
A movement begun by a man who knew almost nothing about the female body until after he was married.
You did not even know about menstruation at all. You had no idea what it was. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know when it is happening, how it is happening, even where it is happening. I don't know.
And he says his wife Shanti wasn't particularly interested in discussing it.
This is the greatest taboo. Wife never talked to husband, daughter never talked to mother.
That comes at a high cost in public health. Some experts say millions of girls across the developing world miss school during their periods and remain susceptible to infection throughout adulthood. Sanitary pads are widely advertised in India, but surveys suggest only about 1 in 10 women actually uses them. At first, Muruganantham suggested them to his wife.
I asked simply, there is some products in the market, why you are not using that? She instantly told, I also know about that, but we have to cut our family milk budget.
Milk budget.
Yeah, then I find it is a matter of affordability.
He could afford one package of sanitary pads and gave it to Shanti as a gift, partly to find out how they were made and why they had to be so expensive.
The white substance inside uses cotton. The raw material cost of the cotton is few pennies, but I bought the product for dollars. Then even being illiterate, I thought, why not try to make an affordable pad for my wife?
Over the next few years, he tried using local cotton to replicate the commercial pads. His wife suffered through early prototypes that didn't work and went back to using a rag. Muruganantham then coaxed some female medical students to try his subsequent models, figuring the future doctors would be less shy. And he even began wearing a pad himself, creating an artificial uterus and rubber bladder, coaxing a local butcher to provide the raw material, and testing it out while he rode a bicycle.
I filled goat blood, animal blood in it. I tied on my hip. There is a tube connection to the napkin and the bladder.
Shanti had had enough.
Everyone in the village was saying he had gone off his head. I was truly afraid. People said he had become like a vampire, that he was doing crazy things.
She asked me I want to go to my parents' farm for a few days. She never come back. On third month, I got a divorce notice from my wife.
She filed for divorce?
Yeah, I got a divorce notice.
His mother, who lived in the home, also left him, but his curiosity did not leave him. He called an American supplier posing as an industrialist in his hometown of Coimbatore, looking to branch out into feminine hygiene products.
Then I claimed myself, I am a mill owner in Coimbatore. Please send some sample.
The samples arrived, and one day when he wasn't home, his dog tore into them.
He took the courier cover, scratches it. Oh my God, I saw a secret. The fiber. You can see the fiber.
So the dog opened this for you?
Opened it, the scratches with the angry.
It was cellulose, he discovered, that when scratched vigorously becomes sponge-like and highly absorbent. It took 2 years to perfect a machine to fluff up the cellulose, he said, a modified food blender in which the blades have to be angled just so.
It's got a prestigious award from Indian Institute of Technology as the best innovation.
It's simple, easily replicated, and can be modified to work without electricity, he says. The pads can be made and sold for a fraction of the commercial varieties.
This is the model for how Muruganantham would like to see his product distributed. Thousands of small factories run by groups of women producing these sanitary pads at very low cost and selling them directly to women.
Women are far more comfortable buying the pads from women directly, rather than from a store, Muruganantham says. Feminine hygiene is not discussed in open company. Our own questions elicited nervous laughter from the very women making them, even as they praised their product.
There's definitely a benefit. Before we were using only cloth and it was very difficult. Now girls don't have that difficulty. It is much easier for them than it was for us.
Muruganantham is determined to change this.
I want to make this as a low-cost sanitary pad movement across the globe.
Helped by awards and his own advocacy, more than 4,000 small factories have started making his sanitary pads across India, each with its own local branding and language.
Malar is meaning of flower.
He gets no royalties from any of this. His workshop does sell the machines, enough to earn him a modest living. But nothing is patented. He wants others to copy or even improve the machine and methods.
The world is shortage of solution providers. Everybody, they want to be in the Forbes list. Under 200.
Everybody wants to be in the Forbes list.
Forbes list. Nobody wants to be a solution provider.
In the end, Shanti decided her husband was a solution provider. She returned after a 5-year separation. Somewhat sheepishly, she admits.
They had his interview on TV that he had discovered sanitary napkins. So I called him, and then I came back. He was angry. I told him I did not want to get in his way. That's why I stepped aside. Now we are happy.
Happy for what her husband's work may mean for young girls like their 8-year-old daughter, Preeti Shri.
The strongest creature created by God in this world, not the tiger, not the elephant, not the lion, the women.
If any man doubts this, he says, see how long you can endure a sanitary pad in your daily routine. For the PBS NewsHour, this is Fred DeSam Lazaro in Coimbatore, India.
Fred's reporting is a partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota.
It's one of my most satisfying experiences getting that piece on. The NewsHour, long under female leadership, was dubious about whether we could do this. But I'm grateful that they allowed us, Mike Fritz, my producer, and I, to try and prove that we could deliver a story that passed the dinner hour test. I've tried to follow up on Muruga's story. Not much in the media that's new since our report. There was a Bollywood film made about him. Of course, the lead actor was 3 shades lighter skinned, and the film took liberal license to, forgive the pun, to pad the story. And there have been innovations since then in making pads that are more environmentally friendly, reusable cloth ones, for example. Unfortunately, at the scale that we are, I just don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the bandwidth to keep on top of this, to follow up. And there's not much chance we'll get a broadcast follow-up anytime soon. And that's where our hope is an academic collaboration, or several of them, that keeps a website current, up-to-date, and a source for learning. Most of the stories that we do on this site are categorized broadly. I wouldn't pretend that they are thorough or fully up-to-date. One of my hopes is that this library, and there are some 300 of these segments, can be updated in partnership with a class, perhaps. It's a work in progress for us. But even without it, I think the power of this kind of storytelling is just undisputed. I think we can squeeze so much more value from these stories by putting them in the classroom, and it just really helps the cause of raising the money that we need to keep doing this. I want to go back to the topic of climate extremes, where I think we're increasingly going to have to find new and creative ways to sustain coverage. The definition of extreme keeps being ramped up each year, as I indicated in the Pakistan example. Not hard to get a few days in of coverage in the aftermath of a disaster, but what happens beyond that? How do communities rebuild or not? What's next for them? And there's very little space for that. And with each new disaster, humanitarian agencies struggle to convey what sounds like the same litany all over again. It's kind of like a PBS pledge drive. Didn't we just hear that? And so, the UN World Food Program and other humanitarian agencies are falling increasingly short in their appeals. And when we were in South Sudan for a different story than the one that we showed you, but part of the same series, we heard a UN World Food Program official describe their situation as having to take from the hungry to give the starving. It is indescribably grim in many ways. And for our part, we want to get beyond the fly in the eye, the demeaning poverty porn that inevitably emerges in these circumstances, that some appeals are forced to use to convey the despair. As I indicated earlier, you will not draw eyeballs to chronic human suffering absent solutions-oriented narratives. So that's what we keep looking for, and we found one that I think is worthy.
Leaders from African countries are meeting this week in Gabon, trying to come up with strategies to combat climate change. The toll from extreme weather has devastated vast regions of sub-Saharan Africa, suffering from the worst drought conditions on record and a severe food crisis. Correspondent Fred Lazaro looks at one effort to help farmers affected by changing weather patterns. This story is produced in partnership with the Pulitzer Center.
Like much of East Africa, South Sudan has suffered scorching droughts. Yet, in a cruel twist, many parts of this country are actually still inundated from flooding late last year.
What has happened in the last 3 years in South Sudan has never been seen in living memory.
Niall Tietmamer is a climate scientist based in South Sudan's capital, Juba. This country has been ravaged by war before independence in 2011, civil conflict since then, and erratic weather. Flooding added hundreds of thousands of climate refugees to those fleeing conflict. About 2 million people live in squalid camps. The country faces an acute hunger crisis.
So the fields, as you can see, are pretty waterlogged already, and we're told that the rains have not really arrived in earnest.
Just outside the northern city of Malakal, we visited farmers laboring on and preparing their fields, investing as much in hope as any harvest.
We grow okra, collard greens, maize, and cassava, but because of all the water, most of these things are not going to be planted.
Nyanakim Achuel belongs to a women's garden group organized by the Christian humanitarian group World Vision.
We've seen a lot of changes in the weather compared to the years before, and our output has been very low.
Scientists see a much longer trend. Across East Africa, average temperatures have risen a full degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, over the past 50 years, making for hotter dry seasons and wetter rainy ones, the drought-baked soil unable to absorb water fast enough to prevent flooding.
Much of the water that is in East Africa here in the region is from the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is one of the most warming oceans in the world. And because of this warming, there is a lot of evaporation that is bringing rain to East Africa.
From a global perspective, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has noted a 1/3 reduction in yields as a result of climate change over the last 60 years.
Andrew Yoon founded the Kenya-based 1 Acre Fund, a nonprofit that helps farmers in several African nations produce more and adapt to the changing climate. Small farmers make up the majority of the world's poor, Yoon says, yet little is being done to help them.
Less than 2% of climate finance goes to farmers. It's just absolutely crazy that like one of the most affected populations in the world, one of the most vulnerable populations in the world, and there's like they don't even exist as part of the climate dialogue. And there's lots of really actionable, scalable, cost-effective things that we can do.
1 Acre Fund serves about 1.4 million farmers who've signed up for its program. That size allows it to buy good quality seeds and fertilizers at bulk discounts, which are passed on to farmers along with credit to purchase these resources. And if a crop fails, there's limited insurance through loan forgiveness. And the group educates farmers, providing critical expertise. Hundreds of field agents like Marie-Claire Mugeni in eastern Rwanda advise on how to space seeds, the right doses of compost and fertilizer, and the best time to plant.
They taught us how to properly use fertilizers and how to apply lime in the field for acidity.
53-year-old Immaculée Mukamana says her maize crop yields doubled when she first joined 1 Acre Fund 2 years ago, but after this year's drought, she has very little food left in reserve.
I was expecting more than 660 pounds of maize. I got just 88.
To help survive lean years, 1 Acre Fund is now pushing members to diversify, to grow more than one compatible crop in the same field, for example, or grow specialty crops like vegetables. Proteus Baruch Wanabusa had a poor crop of maize and potatoes this year, but with bumper harvests a year earlier, he had savings. He purchased a diesel pump which now waters an abundant field of vegetables he'll sell in nearby markets, insurance against another sparse grain or potato crop.
I'm currently growing tomatoes, green peppers, and eggplants. Before I could grow these vegetables, but not at a large scale. But since I now have this pump, I use it to irrigate, even during dry season or when there is no rain.
Another climate-driven initiative here is planting 1 billion trees on farmers' lands. Other such campaigns have been difficult to sustain. But One Acre Fund says its focus is on the economic benefits as much as environmental, using trees that can provide wood or fruit.
At the edge of the tree nursery is a demonstrator model, if you will, that should clinch the deal with any reluctant farmer. This 2-year-old avocado tree is already about 10 feet tall. It's already bearing fruit, and in 1 year will be considered full-grown, and at that stage is expected to bear something like 600 pounds of avocado each season.
When farmers sell those avocados, if they're not able to find markets, they can eat them, and avocados are obviously wonderful for child nutrition. And then, of course, there's a modest carbon benefit because that tree is never cut down.
It sounds good in theory, but
The trees I got, they died.
So I'm going to cut that short because we're running short of time. This is a story that illustrates both the challenge and how it's being met. The One Acre Fund project offers farmers things that are taken for granted by our own growers in this part of, certainly near where I live in Minnesota and in Iowa. They get credit, they get good inputs, they get extension services and crop insurance. What a revolutionary idea. And it's applied to smallholder farmers. Andrew Yoon began this project about 15 years ago with 40 families. He's up to 1.4 million today, self-sustaining NGO. And they are doing extraordinary research into seed varieties that thrive in microclimates. It's just breathtaking, the innovation that you see in story, when you uncover stories like this one. Moving along very, very quickly here because we have a hard out at 6 o'clock. I wanted to add one aspect. This is just one little note about how expensive it is and how difficult it is to work in some of this geography. In South Sudan, where you saw us, we had to charter a plane to get beyond Juba. That's many thousands of dollars. It costs a lot of money to get to places that are difficult to get to, but we need to do that and get beyond the bias in favor of reporting from Anglophone countries that are easy to navigate, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda. And that's the reason we did this story from, not this one, this story from South Sudan instead of Kenya. But it's a tough schlep to raise the funds to go to places, but they need our attention. Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, which is where I took this picture at my $600 a night Radisson Blu in Abuja. I don't really know what that means, but it was forbidden. I want to move us right along to the last one, because one of the things that happened after this event was that we had, all of a sudden, the Untold Stories Project in front of the world's most told story. And because it was so difficult to get around, there was nobody that could fly in, and so it was right there that we became the frontline reporting team for all that followed George Floyd's murder, the uprising. We covered the police reform, the police trials. And then we looked around and found all manner of stories about issues that underlie the problems that we've seen in Minnesota, a once lily-white state that has become demographically far more diverse in recent times. So we've looked at education reform. This is Alan Page, an eminent jurist, a member of the Minnesota Supreme Court, who's more famous as an NFL All-Star with the Minnesota Vikings. Housing gaps, the use of skin-lightening creams in non-white communities universally, but especially among immigrants in Minnesota. There were so many global stories to be told right in our backyard that we wanted to make less foreign to our audience. But the one that I find most fulfilling is the one I'm going to close with, which is personally very, very satisfying, and it's a piece that we did in the race and social justice portfolio that is growing here, and it's called Mothers of Gynecology.
The history of gynecology as a medical specialty has deep roots in the American South, but that legacy is as complicated as the history of the South itself. Correspondent Fred DeSam Lazaro has our report from Alabama's capital, Montgomery. It's part of Fred's series, Agents for Change, and our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
Welcome to More Than a Tour.
For some years, Michelle Browder has conducted trolley tours of Montgomery,
This is her apartment, so I would invite you to get out.
from Rosa Parks' home to the bus depot that's now the Freedom Rides Museum.
This is where they were beaten and bludgeoned, right here.
Alabama's capital is a living history museum of the civil rights era, with so many iconic events, people, and places.
Buses are coming.
But for Browder, artist by training, activist by leaning, there's one chapter of an earlier history that she's working to rewrite. It's manifest in a monument on the Capitol grounds to James Marion Sims. He was a physician who practiced here in the 1840s, developing tools for pelvic exams and a technique to suture vaginal tears called fistulas. To Michelle Browder, that's only half the story.
There's nothing on the monument now that says anything about the women that he worked
Oh, absolutely
on.
not. Nothing of these 11 enslaved girls of African descent that were tortured, mutilated, without anesthesia. Nothing that talks about what they contributed, forcibly, of course.
No mention of them either in a well-known painting immortalizing Sims as the father of modern gynecology. Michelle Browder first saw it as an art student 3 decades ago.
I was triggered. From there, I had promised myself that one day I will change that narrative. Got the welding station.
A promise renewed years later when she moved to Montgomery and discovered the statue at the Capitol.
I was horrified. I still am. If he's the father of gynecology, the father of modern gynecology, then where are the mothers?
Browder decided she'd do something about it. Relying heavily on Sims' own notes, she focused on the only 3 women actually named in his writings.
That is a lot of welding and sculpting.
Mm-hmm.
How many people doing this?
15 volunteers.
Today, about a mile from the Sims Monument, are soaring wrought iron tributes to the women she calls the mothers of gynecology: Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy.
They didn't have autonomy, so it just makes sense for them not to have arms and feet.
The young women endured months of trial and error as Sims honed his technique to repair their fistulas. The humiliating vaginal injury, usually caused by obstructed labor, renders women incontinent and unable to bear children.
If you see around her legs there, that wire represents the silk suture, sutures that he used to basically torture them. And then, of course, Betsy, her crown is made up of the speculum.
And tell us the significance of the flower in its place.
Yeah, so throughout all of the trauma, something came out of it that's been useful for women suffering from this condition.
The first time that I ever viewed the monument, I cried, and I didn't know exactly why.
Lauren Marcel and Alana Taylor are local artists and recent transplants to Montgomery. They were on the day's tour.
Just seeing that work erected in such a way as a healing device was beautiful.
The only thing that differentiates us from these women is time.
There was no such thing as informed consent from patients or subjects in experimental medical trials in Marion Sims' day. The only consent that mattered had to come from slaveholders who had a keen economic interest in the health of their workers, and because these were young women, a particular interest in their reproductive health. Especially so after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished.
If it's outlawed in 1808 that we cannot go back and traffic folks from Africa, then where are we getting these people? From the neighborhood? Breeding plantations. Breeding.
Black women's, their wombs are the engines that maintain the institution of slavery.
Deidre Cooper Owens is a medical historian and author. As for anesthesia, she says, it was not commonly used in Sims' day. But his reason for avoiding it rested on a widely held stereotype that black people do not feel pain, something contradicted, she says, in his own work.
I call it racial cognitive dissonance. He holds on to the ideologies or sets of beliefs that are swirling in the 19th century, that black people are somehow different than white people biologically. But he'll write, this patient lost sense of herself and struggled violently as we had to restrain her during surgery. Why would you need to restrain a black patient who is insensible to pain?
And you look at today that even with all the advancements that we have, that African American women tend to have higher mortality and morbidity, and I think it's just a trickle down from the troubles that our ancestors had to endure.
LaToya Clark, a Montgomery obstetrician-gynecologist, says anti-black stereotypes have endured through the years. Even today, she notes, studies find many providers believe African Americans feel less pain, that their complaints are exaggerated. The flip side, she says, is deep distrust of the healthcare system. Do you have patients who actively want to see you because they think you're more culturally competent, because they think that you would better understand their predicament?
Yes, I've had numerous patients that say that I've seen a man gynecologist all my life and now I want to see a female gynecologist, or I wanted to come to an Afro-American gynecologist.
For Michelle Browder, the next step in reframing Sims's legacy is quite literal. A mural based on that fateful painting, this time with Sims on the operating table. It will be installed in a new Mothers of Gynecology Center she's opening in a downtown Montgomery building that's brimming with history and irony.
This is the site of the Negro Women's Hospital.
The very site, it turns out, where J. Marion Sims experimented on his enslaved patients. When they weren't on the table, she says, these women became skilled surgical attendants, nursing women through their ordeals. And tell us your grand plan for this space now.
Prenatal care, and then upstairs, a teaching clinic with the hopes of teaching empathy, dignity, and respect.
Browder says she's faced occasional pushback in this deep red state where Sims is revered for work that was indeed groundbreaking.
I've had some doctors say that I'm actually trying to stain this man's reputation, who's actually done something good. He was a man of his time. In any case, whether or not he was a man of his time, then his time was barbaric, and therefore he was barbaric. So let's start there, and then seek out ways to help and repair what's just broken.
And then there have been moments of grace, notably after she explained her plans for the new center to the white owners of the building.
She says, "Oh, Michelle, just little Miss Gone with the Wind." She was like, "We're just so proud of you. And if you're going to do all of that, we're going to let you have that building for $35,000.
Not what you expected.
Just don't judge the book by the cover.
The building is appraised at $250,000, she says. A ribbon cutting for the Mothers of Gynecology Health and Wellness Museum and Clinic is scheduled this coming Mother's Day. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Fred DeSam Lazaro in Montgomery, Alabama.
Fred's reporting is supported in partnership with the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota.
And
the history of...
Okay, enough. And thank you. I'm going to wrap up very quickly by saying we've all manner of evidence that suggests that characters in these stories drive people in our audience to do extraordinary things. It is very impactful, and I'm really committed to building this website as a resource in the classroom to enhance learning. And that's where most of our energy goes when I'm not in the field. I'm breezing through a lot more so that I can get to the place where you can like us. And we'll now open this up for questions or comments that you might have. Thanks for your attention. I'll keep talking, if not.
Thank you very much for that. I watched those stories and I felt good. As you say, it brings out the higher aims in us. You do it on PBS. I'm willing to bet right now if we went to ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, we'd be watching sensational, more negative news. But PBS is the most respected. I saw BBC right behind it. And so I'm just curious about the business model and whether there's a paradox. Those other networks probably make a lot of money by feeding us that. The business model for PBS, could you do this in a for-profit setting? And is there an inverse relationship between making money and providing good quality news that lifts us up?
I don't know what characters are attracted to PBS versus the commercial networks, and how much commercial or entrepreneurial gumption some of us have, and maybe it's just in our DNA. I mean, we're not just nonprofit. Some of us just think anti-profit. I think I don't know how to cast it, but no. I think motivation, makes a big difference. We have a number of refugees from the commercial networks who now are at PBS or at the NewsHour. And these are people who've brought new energy, new pacing to the writing. I'm a much better writer today than I was a few years ago. And that's natural evolution, but it's also the influence. So there are cross-influences that I think help, but each of these networks has their place and has their mission. We just want you to keep watching between pledge breaks, which happen every 6 months. Commercial guys want you to watch, between commercials, basically, and it's all about that. Or the streaming platforms, which are new, and it is an all new world. The business model, is broken for traditional media, and we're all still, I think, feeling our way through all of this. And it's way above my pay grade to talk about business models, but we're happy where we are. Over here. Oh, okay.
Hi. You seem to make a distinction between international journalism and global journalism. Can you say more?
Rhetorical mostly, but it's essentially it's an attempt to take America out of the center of a lot of it. I think we have to look in our own backyard about for stories that fundamentally are underpinned by some of the same issues. It's a pursuit of equity in many cases, and so I like to think global as everywhere, international as sort of overseas. But don't hold me to it too much. But I'd like to think that henceforth, our portfolio will be, if not equally divided, somewhat divided, 60% international, 40% local. And a number of stories, one I didn't show you, was about the migration of people undocumented from Mexico who come to support the dairy industry in Wisconsin, which until a few years ago called itself America's dairy land. It's where all the dairy farmers are. 60% of the workforce is a migrant worker, and most of them undocumented. And it's an extraordinary story in which nobody asks and nobody tells about this. Everybody understands that this is a very conservative country. And beyond that, the organization we profiled is a group of farmers who get together every year and go down to Zongolica, Mexico, which is near Veracruz, to thank the families of the men who work on these farms for letting them come up and sustain the farms. And you see in this piece the heavy toll that it takes on families when these men leave at great peril and cost to come and work in this backbreaking work that the farmers will tell you they would never get Americans to do. And at the ground level, the story was about how immigration, this rancorous issue, when you turn off the talk radio and the talk TV, is an issue that looks very, very different. You've gotten past the villainous, faceless masses at the border, and you've gotten to Pedro and Alonzo, who are your friends who work in your dairy barn. I don't know where I was going with that, but international, global, this world is becoming considerably more connected with every passing year.
Thank you for being here.
Yes.
You spoke about wanting to bring this into classrooms and to have an educational component to it. Can you talk a little bit about like your aspirations and what that looks like? Is it workshops? Is it media literacy program? Is it having students with you as you're telling these stories? What does that look like ultimately?
What we're trying to do is to place these stories in curricula, in syllabus, in syllabi, because anecdotally, the people who watch the NewsHour routinely will pluck this off, professors. Our targets are not the students, but the instructors. They will find a piece that checks off a lot of boxes, and it's a lot easier to learn from a short video than it is from a textbook, I dare say, with all deference at this august university to people who write textbooks. There is a role for this kind of learning, and we're trying to get it incorporated into curriculum. We have, as I said, about 300 segments on our website, and all of them have a set of discussion questions. Some of them have more learning materials just to prod a conversation and to be used in the classroom. Some of you might remember the Ted Koppel Nightline format, which began with a field report. And then you came back to the studio and experts discussed whatever was in the field. And it's sort of the same model. I should add that the Ted Koppel Nightline people are now at the helm at the NewsHour. And I think that's a good thing. Charles.
You talk about the joys of entrepreneurship.
You need amplification, Charles. Even you do.
I hope you could talk a little bit about the joys. You mentioned the challenges of entrepreneuring, but talk about the joys of inventing your own show.
Oh, joys. No, it's a labor of love because we get, there is no thrill comparable to doing a story like that one and discovering it. That hasn't been on any other network to the best of my knowledge. A lot of them are a result. The sanitary pad piece was not my original. I got it out of the New York Times Magazine, actually. And it was, of course, off limits. It could never be a television piece. So there's a thrill in turning that into one. So one of the things, when I struggled to raise funds, when I struggled to get the attention of academics as partners, one of the thrills that I retreat to is the craft of writing these stories and producing these stories. There is no comparable thrill, and it ultimately boils down to that. And the idea of bringing unlikely characters into these stories, like the South Sudanese climate scientist. I never thought we would find a South Sudanese climate scientist, and I never thought it because we're conditioned to not look in so many of these instances. A climate scientist would usually be a UN official who lives in a gated community somewhere in Juba or in name your country. Those are the joys, that I derive from this. And as a grandfather now, I don't know. I'm free to travel more, much as I miss the children, and that's liberating. So there is a thrill in going out and discovering places and people. I'm rambling on. Is there any other?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for coming and presenting what you have. The stories that you've told are undertold in many cases because there just either wasn't an interest or enough information. But there are other stories that would be best described as stories that people who don't want you to tell them, that they are stories to be suppressed. How have you? What are examples of stories where you have gone out and people did not want you to tell the story? And how have you managed this? And how do you choose which stories to tell?
Well, I'll preface it by saying that often I don't succeed in doing the stories that people don't want you to do. It's very, very, it's a very serious problem, frankly, and I'm talking systemically, globally. I mean, there are many countries that are not welcoming to journalists, that are very oppressive. I needn't tell fellows, certainly, about how repressive it is to work in certain countries as a journalist. And the authorities will oftentimes, not give you the right visas, etc. So we do have to play cat and mouse in many instances to get where we need to do, to get, the access that we need. And we work, we have tried and tested workarounds, and sometimes you pivot. The story about Sister Cyril Mooney, for example, was first shot in 1998. And I'd actually gone there to do a story about how Mother Teresa's nuns were faring a year after her death, because she was a fundraising magician for this massive organization. And our story, our original mission was, how are they doing now? And despite communicating seriously in advance that we were coming and getting, what we thought was a green signal, we got to the doorstep and they said, oh, we're not doing media this month. And I said, I'm not rich and I've spent a lot of money to be here. I need to do this story. And so you asked around, and I was determined to do the Mother Teresa story, so we went to her biographer, who willingly talked about her and what happened, and we didn't need the missionaries of charity to participate in the story. So you can work around in that fashion. And then I looked around. I happened to have an older sister who's now passed, who was a religious, and she said, go and see Sister Cyril. Mother Teresa deals with the destitute and the dying. This woman is trying to prevent that from happening by educating young people and protecting them. And now you had the story. So there are workarounds, and with the shoestring operation that we have, we can afford to do, we cannot afford to do anything but, try to find those. And it's something any journalist would do. One more?
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about the, in your focus, there is a very kind of one distinct, I think, part of what you're focusing on, which is this, and what's kind of stuck in my mind is the solutions-driven part. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit more about why, I don't know if that came from you or from the producers or came up organically, but why did you decide to kind of focus on the solutions-driven journalism or solutions-driven sort of, or people who are kind of interested in solutions-driven or in coming up with solutions to better the world, I guess. Right. And how do you differentiate, it's maybe that's the second part of that question, but then how do you differentiate sort of what you do with, I think there's a lot of, if you look at the website, there is a lot of categories that overlap very heavily with what international NGOs do. So how do you differentiate what you do with what these educational or personal hygiene or public health NGOs do, and the materials that they produce, and which also highlight their community heroes, people important in the community? How do you sort of make a mark for yourself there? Thank you.
Lots of things to unpack there, and I'll try and tackle them without asking you to restate some of that. But I think, first of all, some of this just organically happens, not by design. It just evolves. I did not, during the fellowship, sit down at Zingerman's over a cup of coffee and take pencil and paper and write down a strategy. You work opportunistically to find where you can go. I was interested, as I said, based here and learning about HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm from India. It was a very, very difficult country to work in, or perceived as so, and didn't get much attention. I had an ability to do that based on my background. I could navigate it more easily. So it was, if you will, a competitive advantage. No one was competing necessarily. But you find your niche and your strengths. And if you go to places like India and sub-Saharan Africa, what are you finding? You're finding a lot of human suffering and a lot of poverty. And you have to find a way to tell those stories and tell them in ways that will draw an audience. Do I cringe sometimes that our content is inherently boosterish? I do. I mean, it's counterintuitive for journalists to do things like that. We try to add texture wherever possible. So there are compromises that you have to make. What distinguishes what we do from the garden variety NGO video will be self-evident if you compared both of them. And of course, the NGOs are always thrilled when we do something about them. I've done stories about MSF, about Partners in Health, about any number of NGOs, and they have in turn used it to raise often millions of dollars because the video has credibility, because it comes from an organization that's done it journalistically. I'm not an advocate of any of these people. I'm just a storyteller and a journalist. I don't advocate for any of these people in theory, even as they've become friends. So it's complex. You do the best you can as the environment shifts under you.
I'm going to reserve the right to ask a final question.
Okay. I thought you were going to kick me out.
No. You sort of alluded to it here, that you didn't go to Zingerman's and write a strategy. For the fellows here and for students taking classes and thinking about their career, you also said at one point during the talk that now, you've been doing this work with PBS since 1985, that you find yourself a better writer in recent years. Can you talk about what you thought was ahead of you at the end of the fellowship and what the fellowship has given to you over the years? I think it's especially fitting because this is the Eisendrath Symposium, and so much of what we do is about helping people see a long potential for themselves, and to see this one academic year. I often tell people that April marks the beginning, not the end. And so can you talk about what that beginning was like for you and how the fellowship has evolved in your mind?
I alluded to some of it, Lynette. We have, when you come to this part of the fellowship, what you've got a month left now, just about, you start to think, what are you doing next? And I had the benefit of being employed at the time. I was not necessarily a freelancer, so I was able to pitch stories and say, I've just come out of this immersion in an academic institution. I've learned a lot about HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'd like to pitch some stories. The fellowship took us to places, not to Turkey, not to Argentina, to Chicago. And
Chicago's a wonderful place.
no arguments about that. We enjoyed every last bit of it, but especially Detroit. And I developed a real affinity, for that city, and came back to do some of the most fulfilling work in the city of Detroit after it, informed by so much that I learned during the fellowship and people that I made contact with. Neil Shine, who was eventually the publisher of the Detroit Free Press, became a good friend who I would go and visit. There was Father Cunningham at Focus Hope, and Eleanor Jositis. I still wear a lapel pin from Focus Hope. So it had lasting impact from that standpoint. But what it did is it gave me credibility, access, and connections to people like Larry Brilliant. Larry Brilliant was a person I met here. For those who don't know, he went on, or he'd already done that by the time he was here. He was on the front lines of the smallpox campaign in India. He was a Detroit native, went to medical school at Wayne State, and went to India during his hippie days, and somehow winds up at WHO, becomes a public health doc. He helped eradicate smallpox. I met him here. He went on, while he was in India, he met this disheveled guy that the WHO didn't know what to do with, because he showed up at the front desk, and the receptionist called the only American she knew, which is Larry Brilliant, and said, "Can you come deal with this guy? We don't know what to do with him." Well, the guy's name was Steve Jobs. He dealt with him, they became good friends, and so on and so on. Larry Brilliant went on to do amazing things. He's now in semi-retirement in California. We've kept in touch. He's been a resource for a number of public health stories that I've done. So you've swelled what we used to call the Rolodex, the contacts list now. As a result of this, I don't know how many boxes I'm checking off of the answers I should give you, Lynette, but and there are things that I can only look back and say, trace back to the fellowship, some of these friendships, but it's your whole bearings. And in sort of a nebulous way, it is the credibility that being here brought me, because I had contact with a number of these luminaries, I had background, I had so much time on my hands to do that. And a lot of my fellows, spent time in the library. I didn't spend as much time in the library, but I did meet a lot of very eminent people that I came back to talk to as resources.
I think that's good parting wisdom, to make sure to...
And it was not clear at the time what I was going to do. I had immediate assignments, but no grand horizon plan except aspirations, and I still have those that are unfulfilled. And I'm on Charles's case, and Charles is swift kicking me with totally unreasonable ideas, but it keeps me going. And I suspect you play some role of that nature yourself.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So these stories were great. I want to point out, for those of you who are not journalists, one of the things that I love about watching your work, to have 7.5 minutes or 10 minutes.
7.5.
But 7.5 minutes is a long time for a broadcast story. And so to just watch you work with that luxury of time, and for me to see stories that are not built around a white American expert with brown people in the background is really very important. And so I thank you for your work. I thank you all for coming, and we hope to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.